All right, we're going to get started, everybody. Might as well get started on time. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I am really excited to have you here for the presentation today. I have to say I've had a couple of experiences at the Tableau conference so far. When you have the speaker's badge, people like to ask you what your presentation is on, and then when I tell them the title of my presentation, it kind of shuts down the conversation almost immediately. This is a pretty fun conference, and this is a pretty heavy topic. So I do commend you for spending your Tuesday afternoon on the first day of the conference to come and talk about racial and ethnic disparities in criminal justice. Now, before I introduce myself, I'd just love to get to know who's in my audience really fast. How many people here work for government? Okay, most people. How about nonprofits? Okay, private sector? Oh, okay, okay. That's like a split evenly 3 ways, so that's very cool. Does anybody here work in the criminal justice system? A few people, okay. A lot of what I'm gonna talk about is pretty specific to criminal justice, but the methodologies that we talk about and how we apply those methodologies in Tableau can certainly be used in really any sector. So before we get started, who am I? My name is Amanda Lamb. I'm a senior researcher for Multnomah County in Oregon. And for those of you who don't know Multnomah County, that's where Portland, Oregon lives. And I'm having some technical difficulties over here. I think your screen is fine. But I'm a senior researcher in criminal justice, and I have about 10 years of experience. My background is actually not as a police officer or a lawyer. My background is in performance evaluation and program management. So I came to the criminal justice system about 4 years ago. About a year prior to that, I started working in racial and ethnic disparities, but it was around the education system. So I've got about 5 years of experience working around racial and ethnic disparities, and most of that has been applied specifically to criminal justice. But in addition to that, in my kind of day-to-day job, my focus is racial and ethnic disparities, but I also do things like evaluate new criminal justice programs to determine whether or not they're impacting outcomes, whether or not it's lowering recidivism rates, that sort of thing. So pretty broad as a researcher in Multnomah County. But our agenda for today is I'm going to spend quite a bit of time kind of giving you the lay of the land on what disparities in criminal justice looks like, why it's important to research it, and what are some of the causes that we see in the research. We're going to talk about the methodologies. I'm going to give you 3 really basic methodologies for identifying disparities, and then we'll move and I'll show you how to apply those methodologies in Tableau in a dashboard. And I'm going to end with how we at Multnomah County have used Tableau and a Tableau dashboard to monitor and identify racial and ethnic disparities and then target specific policy changes to reduce disparities in the long term. So I think it's an interesting melding of using a technological solution to look or at least identify a social justice problem and then hopefully actually work to fix it. So before I get too far into the national literature, I want to talk about Multnomah County just very, very briefly. Usually when I tell people I'm from Portland, Oregon, they know a few things about Portland. It rains a lot. We take our food very, very seriously. We're quite left-leaning. And most recently, people are really curious about our legalized pot. I'm not quite sure where that comes from, but people are very curious about how that's going. I assume there's no relationship with the strong relationship with food, but I could be wrong. So in Multnomah County, in the criminal justice system, I will say that it is on the progressive end of the political spectrum, and that is pretty important for the work that I do because it changes the context a little bit. I've done very similar presentations in other parts of the country, and the reaction I get is not the same reaction I always get in Portland. So when I talk about racial and ethnic disparities in Portland, one, people believe, and when I say people, I mean the policymakers that I'm working with, they believe that these disparities actually do exist. That's not the case in every crowd that I talk to. And 2, they also believe that it's a problem. So when I talk to some of my colleagues around the country, they'll say, my leaders acknowledge that disparities exist in our criminal justice system, but they don't care. They don't think it's a problem that actually needs to be solved. That's not the case where I'm from, and I consider myself pretty lucky in that way. Multnomah County has actually done a lot to reduce disparities in our criminal justice system. Here's just a small list of things that have happened at the policy level to reduce some disparities. And some of them work really well. Some of them work for a short time, and then some of them actually don't work at all. And that's not to say that they don't improve outcomes. That's to say they don't improve disparities. Some of them can actually make them worse. So, for example, prison diversion programs are programs that are aimed to send fewer people to prison and keep more people in the community by sentencing them to probation instead of prison. We found that that's working. We are reducing the number of prison sentences and the number of people going to prison. But the rate of reduction is very different when you start looking at different races. And that's an example of where we actually saw disparity increase as a result of that policy. We're working on it, though. So before we start talking specific methodologies and applying them in Tableau, I want to explain a little bit of background on what is disparity. So at its heart, disparity is literally defined as a difference, a great difference between two things. So at the most basic level, it's just a term that describes there's a difference in two or more systems. When we talk about disparities in criminal justice, though, what we typically mean, and what I mean throughout this presentation, is that we see overrepresentation of people of color throughout the criminal justice system. Specifically, people of color nationwide are more likely to be stopped by the police, they're more likely to be arrested, they're more likely to be convicted, they're more likely to be sentenced more harshly, for example, to prison as opposed to probation, they're more likely to receive longer sentences, and they're more likely to get violations once they're out of prison, out of an incarceration setting on parole or probation. And the reason that that matters beyond the most basic unfairness of it is because there are long-lasting consequences to being involved in the criminal justice system. It goes far beyond you get out of prison and then you're done. In most states, once you have a felony conviction on your record, you are no longer eligible for most public assistance programs. You're no longer eligible for public housing. In some states, you are no longer able to vote in elections, so that's 100% disenfranchisement. You are excluded from most employment opportunities. So it's not just the criminal justice involvement itself that matters here. These are long-lasting consequences that often contribute to a cycle of criminal justice involvement. So somebody can't get a job, so they go back to the life that they lived before, which was they made money by dealing drugs, for example. Then they're back in the criminal justice system, and it's a self-perpetuating cycle. And we see those long-term negative consequences more often in communities of color than we do in the white community. There are multiple causes of disparity in the criminal justice system. Not all of them are specific to criminal justice. We're going to talk in more detail about what those are in just a moment, but they can kind of be summarized as structural disadvantage. That's societal. Policies and practices, those are specific to the criminal justice system. And then implicit bias, which is frankly inherent in all people. And again, we will go in more detail in just a moment. So throughout this presentation, one clarification I want to make just right off the top is that when we're talking about disparities, we're talking about disparate impact, not disparate treatment. And they are closely related, but disparate impact is what we are measuring when we're looking at aggregate data sets. That's kind of the big picture. We're seeing that communities of color are more impacted by incarceration than other communities. We're not talking about how individual police officers are treating another individual they're arresting, or how individual judges are choosing to sentence the defendants that stand before them. There's a lot of research on that. It goes kind of away from statistics and criminology, and it goes more towards social psychology. We're going to talk a little bit about it in implicit bias, but predominantly that's not what we're talking about in this particular presentation, and most of the literature and the research around the country is on the disparate impact level. So I want to give a couple of examples of what disparities look like, kind of boots on the ground. So these are studies that have been done nationwide. There's about 40 years of literature on disparities in our criminal justice system, and I kind of liken it to how we talk about climate change. There certainly are people who say disparities don't exist, they don't believe the numbers, but the research community is pretty well aligned that disparities exist. They're more complicated than just they exist, and we're going to talk about that. But the research consistently shows disparities at almost every point in the criminal justice system, starting at stops and arrest. So for example, you might be familiar with New York City's stop and frisk policy. There's been a lot of research done on the outcomes of that policy, where they're allowed to stop anybody on the street and search them, and they're looking for things like guns and drugs. And they found that Black individuals were stopped twice as often as any other group, but particularly white individuals. But the stop was actually less successful, meaning it was less likely to lead in an arrest. They were less likely to be carrying what they called contraband. So their success rate, as they might have it, is actually lower for the people that they were more likely to stop. In Seattle, we see that while black adults comprise about 8% of their city population, they comprise almost 70% of their drug arrests. And that's a rate that's 21 times that for white people in Seattle. So that's a very clear disparity. A little bit of emerging research. We know a lot of this anecdotally, but frankly, the data on uses of force is not very good, especially at a national level, but we're starting to see more literature around this. And it's finding that, once again, people of color are more likely to experience a use of force, both in terms of contacts with the police officers and when they're actually in a jail or a prison. When we're talking about conviction and sentencing, that's kind of the next layer of decisions that the criminal justice system makes as people move through the system. It's harder to study because a lot of it takes place behind closed doors through plea negotiations. But there are a couple of studies that we can turn to that show us that disparities exist in this section as well. We find that defendants of color are less likely to receive downward departures. And what a downward departure is, most states have sentencing guidelines. So if I'm convicted of a robbery 2, the sentencing guidelines might say I spend 12 to 24 months in prison. If I get a downward departure, I might only spend 6 months in prison, or I might get probation. And the research has shown that white defendants are more likely to receive those downward departures than defendants of color. I got another little error message here, sorry guys. And then when we get to incarceration, this is probably one of the more widely distributed statistics. We know that black men are 7 times more likely than white men to be incarcerated nationally. And we also know that in our state prisons, about 80% of the people in state prisons are black and Hispanic men, mostly on drug crimes. So those are just some national examples. Now let's look a little bit at Multnomah County. So this is work that was done by the MacArthur Foundation as part of a grant process called the Safety Justice Challenge. The goal of that grant is to reduce incarceration generally. But one of the areas of focuses are on racial and ethnic disparities in incarceration policies. So what the MacArthur Foundation did was it came to Multnomah County and it took our data and it analyzed disparities by what we call decision points and what they call decision points. So it starts with referrals to the DA. I'm not going to get into it. We don't have arrest data available right now in Multnomah County. They switched systems and now it doesn't talk to anybody. It's a big mess. But we use referrals to the district attorney's office. That's when a cop says, I arrested this guy and charged him with this. And then the district attorney accepts those referrals or doesn't choose to proceed with the case. So it's a good proxy for arrest. And what we found, what the MacArthur Foundation found, was really high disparities at our front end. So this is with regard to black adults in Multnomah County. We also saw high disparities with regard to Native American adults and Hispanic adults. We saw underrepresentation with Asian adults. And I'm going to talk a little bit later about why I'm using the categories that I'm using and the words that I'm using to describe what we're seeing here. So black adults in Multnomah County are more than 4 times more likely to be arrested than white adults. That disparity doesn't get much better, but it doesn't get much worse in the plea negotiation process. They're not much more likely to be convicted, for example. They are 7 times more likely to be sentenced to prison, though. So again, this is an aggregate. We're going to talk about how we can drill down to more specific apples-to-apples comparisons when we get to the dashboard, but that's a staggering disparity. The disparity is also really high when we look at parole violations. So this was kind of a aha moment, I think, for a lot of the policymakers in Multnomah County. I think they knew intellectually that these disparities were a problem, but this kind of threw it out there. And it was a very visual way to say, we have an issue here. So before getting back to Multnomah County, I want to talk a little bit more about the causes of disparities. So we're going to go through each of those 3 categories of causes. The first is structural disadvantage. And this is something that most people think of almost automatically. Is it socioeconomic? Is it education level? Is it employment opportunities? And the answer is yes. Yes, in many cases, disparities can be partially explained by some of these structural disadvantages that unfortunately hit communities of color harder than in the white community. So we know that poverty increases the likelihood of committing or being the victim of a crime. So crime rates are higher in communities that experience more poverty. Those communities statistically are more likely to be communities of color. Something that maybe isn't quite as intuitive is the neighborhood characteristics that can contribute to these disparities that we see. So we know from, again, decades of research that increased density, increased segregation, and a proportionately small community of color in a jurisdiction can lead to higher disparities. So an example is the disparities throughout the criminal justice system are actually much higher in Portland, Oregon than they are in a city like Atlanta. And these aren't necessarily aha, we know why, it's because of urban density. It's more complicated than that, but we do know that statistically speaking, smaller communities of color that are highly concentrated in only certain areas of the city can lead to higher disparities. And then the final structural disadvantage that I want to talk briefly about today are crime rates. Again, we know that socioeconomics can contribute to higher rates of certain crimes. I think that last bullet is particularly important, though. Remember the statistic I told you that 80% of state prisons are 80% of state prison populations are men of color on drug crimes. Study after study has demonstrated that drug use and drug dealing rates are actually the same, almost exactly the same across all racial categories. So it is not the case that people of color are more likely to be using or dealing drugs. That is not the explanation for the disparity in our drug crime rates. Policies and practices. Now, obviously, the criminal justice system itself doesn't have a lot of control over, for example, the quality of our education system. They do have control over policies and practices. That's things like policing, and that might explain some of the neighborhood density and segregation structural disadvantage that we see leading to disparities. If the police are patrolling neighborhoods of color at a higher rate than any other neighborhood, they're probably going to arrest more people of color than they do anyone else. Focus on certain drug crimes, or certain crimes, particularly drug crimes. So if you think back to the example that I used earlier in the city of Seattle, where 8% of the population is black, but 67% of the drug arrests for DCS was the acronym I used. I forgot to explain what that is. That's distribution of a controlled substance, drug dealing. 67% of drug dealing arrests were of black people. There was a pretty extensive study done at the University of Washington trying to figure out why that was. And the conclusion was not a difference in drug rates. And they used really creative methodologies to try to figure out drug rates citywide. The conclusion that they ended up drawing was it was because the police were almost entirely focused on crack cocaine. And so they were targeting a drug that just so happened, by design or not, to be predominantly used by African Americans in the city. And that was the cause of the massive disparity we saw. And then finally, when we look at sentencing laws. So if you think of these as kind of a compounding effect, if somebody lives in a neighborhood that is highly segregated and highly dense, if they don't have a lot of economic opportunity in that neighborhood or access to good education system, and then if the police are also patrolling their area quite a bit more, they are more likely to be picked up on. Most people's criminal activity starts at a very low level. They're things like trespass or breaking curfew or marijuana possession, not in Portland, but in other places. And once you have a criminal record, that criminal record stays with you forever, and it will lead to harsher sentences in later criminal activity. So the use of the criminal history does explain certain parts of the disparity, especially in things like length of prison sentence. People will get a longer prison sentence because they have other convictions in their past, regardless of whether or not those convictions are for like higher order crimes. And the final one, the final cause of the disparities that we see is implicit bias. And the way that the research looks when you start looking into these issues is the researchers they start controlling for a lot of different variables, a lot of what we just talked about earlier. They control for crime rates, they control for criminal history, they control for crime severity, for things like socioeconomic status, your employment history, your education, your marital status, how many kids you have, how old you were at your first conviction, any host of other variables they control for. And what the research consistently shows is there is always something left over. That explains part of the disparity, those control variables. It doesn't explain everything. And that's when social psychology comes in and starts telling us about how implicit bias changes the way that we view people on a day-to-day basis. It changes the way police make decisions. It changes the way district attorneys and defense attorneys make decisions. It changes the way judges sentence. It changes everything. And what implicit bias is, I'm not going to go into this in great detail, but if you think about it, it's not the same thing as racism, and I want to make that really clear. Racism, it could be defined as a conscious belief that certain races have certain characteristics that make them superior or inferior to other races. Sexism is the same thing. There are certain characteristics that are inherent in women that make them inferior in some way to men. That's sexism. The former is racism. Implicit bias, it's also called unconscious bias. It's the way that our brain kind of makes shortcuts about people and starts making assumptions, and we don't even realize it's happening, actually. We don't even realize that it's affecting our decision making and affecting how we view other people. They're the beliefs that we hold without even realizing it, and there's a lot of reasons for that. One of the, I think, better studies, more comprehensive studies on implicit bias is Harvard's implicit bias test. Has anybody ever taken that? Okay, quite a few of you had. A lot of you have probably heard of it as well. It's been around for about 20 years. They've collected millions and millions and millions of data points, and they've found very consistently that in America and the UK, actually, we are more likely to favor men, we're more likely to favor the young, and we're more likely to favor white people. And there's a lot of research that goes into that, and it's very culturally based, and it's a pretty complicated issue. But that's why these disparities are so insidious, because a lot of times people don't even realize that they're making different decisions based on how the person in front of them looks. So that's the only time we're going to dip our toes into the psychology of disparities a little bit. We can talk more about that if you all want in the questions period. But now we're going to talk about measuring disparities. So a quote from Peter Drucker, I'm sure you all have heard this, that you can't manage what you don't measure. In Multnomah County, like I said, we identified this as a problem. Okay, if it's a problem and we actually want to solve it, we have to start tracking it and making sure that we're seeing whether or not what we're doing is working. So I'm going to talk today about 3 different methodologies to identify disparities, and they're all very, very simple. They're calculations that can be done on a quick calculator. They're slightly more complicated when you put them into Tableau, but nothing you all can't handle. The first thing you have to do when you're starting to calculate disparities is determine what your benchmark is going to be. That's going to become a bit clearer as we work through a few examples. You can use the general population. If you think back to the bar chart I showed you with the different decision points, that was benchmarked to the population. The problem with that is each subsequent decision after that initial point, that arrest, is compounding the disparity from there. So it's including the disparity that existed at the point of arrest. And that's why when I do this work, I often recommend people benchmark to the decision point prior. So if you want to look at how sentencing, if there are disparities in sentencing, look at the total, use the total sentence population as your benchmark, not the underlying population. It depends on the question you're answering. So, okay. So the first methodology, I hesitate even calling this a methodology because it's so incredibly simple. And it's just comparing percentages to identify over and under representation. So I'm going to use throughout this example, one of the big projects that I worked on was on use of force in county jails, so you guys are going to see that as an example. So what we see here, for example, black inmates comprise about 20% of our county jail, and I'll have you note that they comprise about 6% of our county population. So we already see massive disparities in people being booked into our jail. 20%, but 40% of our use of force incidences. That's a pretty massive disparity. That suggests, it doesn't suggest, it states that black inmates are more likely to experience a use of force in county jail. And we also see overrepresentation in our Native American population, and we see slight underrepresentation in other populations. So it's really easy to understand percentages. It's a very simple methodology to use. The problem with it is when you start comparing between different groups, it can get a little wordy. It's not that it's impossible to do, it's just it starts to get a little hard to explain. It also doesn't tell you the extent of the disparity. So what happens if next year black inmates comprise 16% of the jail population, but 30% of the use of force? Did the disparity get better or worse? You can calculate it, but it's a little bit difficult to intuit. The next two methodologies we're going to talk about are rates and relative rates. And in order to get to a relative rate, you have to calculate a rate. So we're going to cover both pretty quickly. The relative rate is a relative rate index. I'm going to call it an RRI from here on out. It's calculated by dividing the rate of one population by your reference group. And what it comes out to is, so when I've said things like black adults in Multnomah County are about 4.5 times more likely than white adults to be arrested, that 4.5, that's an RRI. So that's what it allows you to say. If the number that you get is greater than 1, that's overrepresentation. If it's less than 1, it's underrepresentation. And if it's 1, you have parity. Okay, so the first step in calculating an RRI is to determine your reference groups and your test groups. Your reference group is going to be what you're comparing everybody to. So it's going to tell you, in this example, so this is obviously made up, just for the sake of easy calculations. All of our reference and our test groups all have the exact same numbers of use of force. But the overall population, the jail bookings population, is vastly different. So this is kind of step one. And in my work, I usually choose the traditionally advantaged group as the reference group and traditionally disadvantaged groups as the test groups. When I was working in education, I would often use women as the reference group and compare the education outcomes of men to women, because women have recently been outperforming men traditionally in terms of graduation rates and grades and things like that. But it depends, again, it depends on the question you're trying to answer. So after you've determined what your groups are, your reference group and your test group, now you calculate the rate. And the rate is just the total number of incidents that you're testing given your benchmark population. So in this case, that's just dividing 10 by 1,000. So you have 10 use of force incidences, 1,000 total bookings, you end up with a decimal. To get the rate per 1,000, you multiply it by 1,000 again. So what this tells you is 10 out of every 1,000 bookings for the reference group includes a use of force. 20 out of every 1,000 bookings for test group number 1 includes a use of force, and that number is 50 out of every 1,000 for test group number 2. And so the advantage of this particular methodology is, again, it's very easy to understand. It's easier to identify differences between groups, because it starts getting to the extent of the disparity. So we can automatically see that the disparity in test group number 2 is much higher than in test group number 1. And then to get to the relative rate, all you do is you divide the rates of the test group by the rate of the reference group. So your test group, your RRI is always, or your reference group RRI is always going to be 1. So 10 divided by 10 equals 1. Very simple. 20 divided by 10 equals 2. So what that enables you to say is in test group number 2 is twice as likely as the reference group to experience a use of force in jail. Test group number, I think I said 2. Test group number 2 is 5 times more likely than the reference group to experience a use of force in jail. So again, each of these identify disparity or overrepresentation. You frame the issue a little bit differently when you're describing the results. So with percentages, you describe then 20% of jail bookings, but 40% of use of force. That indicates a disparity. We already talked about some of the pros and cons in that particular area. With the rates, I think the con becomes really clear here. It's wordy. And if you want to start comparing rates between different groups, it obviously is going to get even more wordy. And if you want to start comparing rates over time, now it gets more wordy. Again, it's not impossible, and it's a very approachable methodology. It's easy to understand, but it doesn't tell you the extent, which is what RRI does. RRI is the best methodology for describing the extent of the disparity, which also enables you to track it over time to see if the disparity is getting better or worse. It becomes easier to compare disparities between different populations, and it's still really easy to understand. The methodology is slightly more complicated, but not so complicated that people can't understand it. So I do have a couple of quick notes on assessing disparity before we actually get into the dashboard. It's important. I started with national context for a reason. I think when you start looking into this research, it's really important to kind of get your bearings first. And the reason I say that is because I have never looked for disparity and not found it. And it's not because I'm cooking the numbers in any way, shape, or form. You are very likely to find disparity in whatever system you're looking at. Agree on appropriate language. So I've mostly used disparity throughout this talk. I'm going to continue to use disparity, although I will warn you, it gets some people really riled up, and they prefer that I use things like disproportionality or over or underrepresentation. They all mean the same thing. It's important to agree on language up front, though. Clarify that you're talking about disparate impact and not disparate treatment. A lot of times when I'm presenting results to a policymaker, I do have to clarify, I am not calling your people racist. I have to say something quite that blunt just to get the hackles to go down a little bit so that we can actually talk about the numbers. And then finally, be really clear on what disproportionality or disparity doesn't tell you, and it doesn't tell you why. It doesn't tell you why that disparity exists. I cannot calculate an RRI and tell you that's because of the structural disadvantage that we talked about, or it's because the education in that community is really bad, or it's because of implicit bias. It doesn't give you that information. Okay. So before I start talking more detail about the dashboard, I just want to have a quick conversation about race data in Multnomah County. It's not great. It's not great. I have been using 5 different words to describe different racial groups in this presentation, and that's white, black, Native American, Asian, and Hispanic. That's because that's the race data that we collect. We do not separate race and ethnicity. We do not allow people to self-report their race. We don't ask them. We allow the police officers to make an assumption on what that person's race is, and then they write it down in a checkbox form. It is not a perfect system. We are working on fixing it. We have a lot of ideas, but there's a lot of questions I can't answer. Example, I have no idea how many people identify as Hispanic and white, or Hispanic or Latin American and black. We know that those populations exist. I would love to be able to allow them to self-identify however they want. Our system just isn't broken down or it doesn't work that way right now. Again, we are working to fix it, but it's slow. So using a dashboard to promote transparency and accountability. I've hinted at this throughout the presentation. You guys can't see this, but I keep getting a little warning box pop up. So when I'm like drilling down and looking like I'm really concentrating, I'm trying to get rid of that warning box because I can't see anything. So we're using dashboards to monitor trends. We're starting to track disparity by a bunch of different filters. You're going to see that in the dashboard. And trying to benchmark it to specific policy changes where we can. Most of the past year and a half of my life has been about building support for this dashboard that I'm about to show you. It is not public yet. That is because it has been a really big challenge to try to build support. And it's not because people are trying to hide anything. This is just really sensitive to the people that are going to be held accountable for the system that I've created. I understand that. I just wish it would work a little faster. So I have worked very, very closely with those individuals. The court system actually wrote the SQL query I used to pull the data from their system anyway. Like, they have been involved. Everybody's been as involved as we possibly can. But I've also been very clear that the dashboard is not meant to be used for operational purposes. So I would not send this dashboard to the jail and say, okay, start making different decisions about the people coming into your jail because your disparity went up really high last week. That is not what this is about. This is the data lags. It wouldn't make sense to use it for operational purposes anyway, but it's really for monitoring trends. And it's also not for identifying the causes of disparity. And I've had to push back a little bit to say that I'm not going to add any economic indicators in the dashboard. I'm not going to try to track down what people's income was before they got into the criminal justice system, because that's not what this is about. This is about measuring impact, and we see disparate impact. So I kind of already talked about this a little bit. I had to do a lot of work to build support for the red dashboard, and we call it the red dashboard. I did not come up with that shorthand. That's racial and ethnic disparities. That particular phrase has been used in Multnomah County for about 15 years now, so we kind of went with that. We've worked on gathering buy-in. I think one of the reasons why policymakers are so hesitant about this is because they don't know what a dashboard is quite yet. So I've been working with them one-on-one, sitting down at their desks saying, this is how you use the dashboard. I put it up in Server first so that they can play with it, so that they can get used to it, so that they can start to internalize what the results are and start, well, frankly, proactively kind of addressing them before it ever even becomes public. And then I'm also building support by creating a red website. I don't think it's fair, actually, to put the dashboard up there and just be like, look at how horrible our system is. As I've tried to show throughout this presentation up to this point, it's more complicated than just our system is really terrible. It's a societal problem that doesn't fall entirely on the shoulders of the criminal justice system, although I don't absolve them of any of their responsibility. I do want to add context and create a red website to allow them an opportunity to say, here are some of the things that we've done in the past. Here are the things that we're planning on doing in the future. So now it's going to get really awkward because I am going to have to crane my neck and look at it this way. So this should be interesting. So this is the dashboard. I'm going to start out, we're just going to kind of walk through. So it does start with kind of a very similar look that you saw in that MacArthur work, and this is by decision point. And it does get, it kind of confirms the results that we've already seen. The only difference here is that I've actually benchmarked to the decision point prior rather than the total population. So you still see disparity in prison sentences, for example, but you don't see it compounded, so you don't see the 7 times, you see about 3.67. But let's look at the jail. So the first thing that you can tell from the jail, this is total bookings. You can see this is the black RRI, the RRI for black inmates, excuse me. And black inmates are about 4.5 times more likely than white people in Multnomah County to be booked into the county jail. You see overrepresentation here, and you see it here. This is in the Native American population. Yeah, and here's where you actually see underrepresentation of the Asian population in our jail. And Hispanic is almost about parity. The other massive disparity that you see is in average lengths of stay. So you can see that black and Hispanic individuals are spending much more time in our jail than white individuals are. So now let's start looking a little bit at these filters over here. So these are release reasons. This bottom bar is release on your own recognizance. So we do release about 1/3 of the people that come through the jail almost immediately. They spend no more than maybe 4 hours in our jail. But we can see that the release rates for black and Hispanic inmates are lower than they are for white and Asian, and Native American inmates are also lower as well. So we can break it down. We can break it down by felonies. We can break it down by misdemeanors. And we're seeing very similar results, right? We're still seeing really high disparities in both of those charge types. In the national literature, again, where the literature is concentrated pretty heavily on what we'd call discretionary crimes. So the way that I describe this, and actually this is a good example of, say, implicit bias. Maybe this is a terrible example, I don't know. But if I were to go out front of this casino right now and smoke pot, for example, I am very unlikely to be stopped or arrested or charged or have any involvement with the criminal justice system because of that. Even if a cop was right there, the statistical likelihood because of what I look like is that I would get maybe a warning, maybe. If a young black male was doing the exact same thing right next to me, his likelihood of getting arrested is much higher. That's a discretionary decision that the cop can choose to make or not. A non-discretionary decision would be things like a murder suspect. A murder suspect is going to get booked into the jail. There is no discretion on the cop's part on whether or not I'm going to book this person on this charge. So what's interesting about when you're looking at the dashboard is to look at the more discretionary charges. So let's take a look at drugs. Again, we see very high disparities. One thing I should have noted, all of these will disappear. The bars, or whatever unit of measure we're looking at, will disappear if the number of people involved is under 5. So if the N is too small, it disappears. So you saw, it's not because this group isn't being booked, it's just not very many of them. So again, you see in some months, black inmates were almost 7 times more likely than white inmates to be booked into the county jail on a drug charge. You're also seeing a huge disparity relative to the lengths of stay on drug charges for Hispanic inmates. Another highly discretionary category is in behavioral crimes. Those tend to be more nuisance crimes. They're things like disorderly conduct, offensive littering, which in Multnomah County is peeing in the park, things like that. You don't have to get booked into jail on those charges. But we see that those who are booked tend to be people of color. And they also tend to stay longer. And they still tend to get released on their own recognizance at a much lower rate. So those are some examples. We can also drill down by primary charge. And I want to show you one example. And it's going to be interfering with public. There are a lot of charges. This is not my favorite drop-down menu, but it is helpful. So it is interfering with public transportation. That's not paying your bus fare, is essentially what that is. People are getting booked into our county jail for not paying bus fare. And In some months, it's almost 15 times that of white people who are being booked into our jail. And you'll see most of them are recogged out, which is good. They shouldn't be staying in jail. There's the person that doesn't pay their bus fare is not a dangerous person. There's no reason to be paying for them to stay in our jails. But you do see really high disparities in this particular crime category, or charge category. So that's the jail. Let's look at case processing. And I may have mentioned already, but case processing is a little bit harder because it is all behind closed doors. It's around plea deals. So it's harder to measure exactly what decisions are being made. But here are a few indicators. So again, this is cases filed by the DA. So this is the DA has decided to proceed on this case. They've received the charges from the police officers and they've decided to proceed. And we see roughly the same disparity as we did in that proxy for arrest category. So the conclusion that we draw from this is disparity is really high at the front end of the system. This is the conviction rate, and I'll pause for a moment to explain the colors. Multnomah County policymakers really like stoplights. That's like their favorite way of demonstrating success and failure. So these are stoplight colors. Red is bad. Green is good, and yellow is somewhere in between. It's between 0.95 and 1.05 is yellow. So we gave them a little bit of a buffer. But we don't see high disparities in conviction rates, which is good. So people who are coming through our system are roughly being convicted at about the same rate. I'll also tell you that over 90% of the people coming through our system plead guilty on some charge. So this is not surprising. Most of the time, the DA's office isn't going to proceed on charges unless they have enough evidence to convict or at least get a plea. But again, let's drill down a little bit. Sorry. So let's look at crime types. Again, so vehicle crimes, those are almost exclusively DUIs and driving while suspended. So the disparity at the front end got much higher for Hispanic defendants, but it actually reduced a little bit for Black defendants. But here's where we see a higher conviction rate. And this is where a little bit more knowledge of our system is helpful as we're working with policymakers to explain what we're seeing here. So what I know from our system is most people who are charged with a DUI go through a diversion program. And if they successfully complete their diversion program, whatever that program is, basically don't drive drunk anymore, their charges get wiped out. So what I think I'm seeing here is actually not high disparities in actual conviction rates. I think that white defendants are more likely to have their charges dismissed. And it could be because people of color aren't being offered the diversion program, or it could be that they're not successfully completed. Either way, this is an indication that we might have a problem here. And I want to look at one. I can show you interfering with public transportation. I'm going to skip that because it's roughly the same story as you saw in the jail. It's a really high disparity rate. But I want to show you, I'm just going to warn you, this is going to be pretty depressing. So I am looking for possession of cocaine, which is also going to be, in Multnomah County, we don't separate crack and cocaine, at least in our charging, so this is also possession of crack. Black defendants are more than 50 times more likely to be charged with possession of cocaine in Multnomah County. That is staggering, and that is not at all uncommon. That exists throughout the country. You want to talk again about why state prisons are predominantly filled with men of color on drug crimes? That's what we're talking about. The conviction rates are also really high. And then the final decision point that we're going to look at today, this is in sentencing. So in this case, I used a parameter to just, you have a drop-down menu, you can talk about the sentence. I broke the sentences down into prison, jail, probation, and fine or fee. Prison, jail are pretty straightforward if you get prison or jail. Probation can include a couple of different programs. It's basically community supervision. And then fines and fees are kind of the lowest level of sentence that you can get. So you can see right off the bat, in most cases, our prison disparity is pretty huge. People of color are much more likely in Multnomah County to get sentenced to prison. You saw that in the decision point bar graph at the very front end. So let's look at probation. You see underrepresentation in probation. And here's why I don't like the stoplight system, because it implies that this is good. Look at how great we're doing in sentences to probation. That's because our sentences to prison, the disparity in that case was so high. That means that people of color are not getting probation as much as they are getting prison, essentially. So I don't like patting ourselves on the back for these green bars right here because they're actually representing a different kind of disparity. So I want to go back to another example that we've been looking at. Here it is. We're going to look at interfering with public transportation again, just to show you what that looks like. Nobody's sentenced to prison on interfering with public transportation. That's good. That would be a huge waste of money. But people are getting probation. Specifically, black defendants are getting probation for not paying their bus fare. That is not only costly to our system, but that now goes on their record. Compare that with a fine or a fee. So this is telling you, again, there's a little bit of overrepresentation in fine or fee, but the story that it's telling you is still that the sentences are harsher for black defendants than they are for white defendants. So now I'm going to take off these filters, go back to all. One of the first pieces of pushback that I always get when I do this sentencing grid is with regard to criminal history. It's because, I'm told, these defendants of color are more likely to have a long criminal history. Frankly, I'm not quite sure how that's a good excuse because of all of the reasons that we've already discussed, but let's test that theory. So we have criminal history on here. We would expect people with a very extensive criminal history to be treated very similarly, right? So now we're starting to compare apples to apples. And we do see some disparity. That's 17 cases. I have the ends all in here. 2017 wasn't over yet. You can see the date ranges that I used. When we have more cases, we don't quite see as much disparity in extensive criminal history. It doesn't all go away, though. It doesn't explain all of the disparity. But let's also look at brief. So we see really high disparity with regard to people who have very little criminal history. Brief, I'm trying to remember the category, and I think it's either zero to 2 misdemeanors or something like that. So this is not an extensive criminal history, but people are being sentenced to prison quite a bit. So, and we can keep looking. The story is pretty much the same. The story is that even when we start drilling down to apples comparisons between people who are charged with similar crimes, people who have similar criminal histories, people who are charged with the exact same crime, we still see these disparities. So none of these kind of control variables that we're talking about. You have a question?
Well, so if you wanted to do that, then wouldn't you be touching on the button for felony under case type and
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we can drill down quite a bit. Unless the bars disappear, the bars tend to show disparity. So my point here is that, yeah, no problem. I mean, the point is to play with the dashboard, right? So that's totally fine. But the point is that the disparity is not explained by any of these variables. And so that's kind of the story that I keep telling my policymakers, which, as you can guess, probably makes me the most popular person in the room most of the time. Okay. I am not sure how to get back to where I want to go. We'll just do it this way. I can't see it. Oh no. Okay. We'll just move forward. Oh, now this thing shows up. Okay. Moving forward. So, okay, so now we've seen the dashboard, right? And I'm gonna go through the rest of the presentation pretty quick. So this is how you apply those RRIs and rates actually in a dashboard. I'm not gonna go into this in a lot of detail. I put it in the slides so that you guys all have access to it. But the bottom line is you're doing about 3 different calculations for every RRI you want. You need to calculate your base population, your population benchmark. Then you need to calculate your rate, and then you get to the RRI. So in those sentence categories, I had 4 different sentences I was calculating on. 3 variables per sentence, that's 12 calculated fields that you need to create. And a couple of notes on that. So in order to calculate RRIs in Tableau, you have to use a table calculation so that the filters will actually work and allows you to manipulate the data a little better. So to use the table calculation, where it always screws up for me is the table calculation, at least in the example that I've used it as a downward calculation, so make sure it's set as downward, and make sure that your reference group is the top row. That's where things always get a little wonky. And then I used parameters, both for the sentences because there were a lot of them and I wanted people to be able to choose them, and also to create filters to prevent when the ends get too low, to prevent people from being able to view the data when the ends get too low. So I am wrapping up now, I promise. I will leave a few minutes for questions. Here's what we found when we looked at the dashboard. We saw huge disparities in our county jail system, both with bookings, with release reasons, and with the lengths of stay. We saw disparities in our case processing, particularly at the front end, and we didn't see a ton of disparities in conviction rate relative to cases referred, but I have plans in the future to add downward departures to this. We do have a data point that we can use for downward and upward departures, so I want to know when people are deviating or are more or less likely to deviate from the sentencing guidelines that we have in Oregon. And then we saw huge disparity in sentencing, particularly in the more discretionary crime categories, and we didn't see that criminal history actually explain those differences in sentencing. So as a result of this disparities work in Multnomah County, our criminal justice leaders have made a lot of policy changes, and I'm just gonna highlight a couple of them. You heard about our legal pot. We've actually decriminalized most drug possession in Multnomah County, in part because of the massive disparities that we saw when I showed you possession of cocaine. Those people are now countywide offered treatment, and if they complete treatment, their case gets dismissed. So no, it doesn't go on their record at all, which is great. The other thing we've done, I showed you interfering with public transportation for a reason. Our district attorney has made the decision to no longer accept cases from the police, from when the police refer them for people not paying their bus fare. So we are no longer putting those people in our criminal justice system. And I mentioned at the very front end, we are working to expand our informed sentencing practices and actually sentence people to prison when they are high risk, as opposed to just because they have a long criminal history. So we are moving away very, very gradually from relying solely on criminal history to decide the severity of sentences. And we're going to continue to use this dashboard, even though it's not public yet. I think it will be public eventually. But even until then, we're going to continue to use this dashboard to target specific policy interventions that are likely to reduce disparities in the long run. And I'm going to tell you right now, if it doesn't work, we'll be back here again. So in conclusion, I'm going to leave you with just this quote, which states that we aren't perfect, but we have the capacity to be more perfect, mile after mile, step after step. We can't ignore the problems we have, but we can't stop running the race. That's how you win the race. That's how you fix a broken system, and that's how you change a country. And this is how I view my role in this system. The criminal justice system in this country is broken for many of our populations. It is not working. It is not just. It is not equal. My role is to point out when those problems are occurring and force people to listen, using a dashboard if I have to put it in their face, using whatever pretty colors they want to see. I will continue to do that because that's how I think we're gonna change this broken system. So thank you all so much for coming. I really appreciate your time.